I'm Scott Al Miller. This is my life living in Leon, Nicaragua. We have a viewer who sent in a really good and tough question today that I think is well worth addressing. So today we're going to be talking about why, if you're asking people who have been in Nicaragua in the last, say, 20 years, why you're going to get conflicting perceptions as to the quality, the safety, the cost of living of life here in Nicaragua. Why is it so wildly different when you talk to different people? And I don't have a perfect answer, as no one can, but I think we have some insight that'll be pretty valuable. I think this is going to be a pretty good topic today, so I'm looking forward to digging into that, and I love that we have a viewer who sent in a video question. We're going to get to that right after the bump.
Hey Scott, I really appreciate your videos. I love your channel. I love your balanced perspective on everything. I love you're always so honest. This is a problem. This is not a problem. This might be a problem. I love that. I have a question about the conflicting information I get from different sources about Nicaragua. I have wildly conflicting reports. On one hand, I have friends who came here from Nicaragua and have been in the United States for about 20 years, and they think Nicaragua is terrible. They think I would be an idiot to move there, and they have had other family and friends that have immigrated to the United States in the last couple of years that are kind of backing up their story about how terrible the crime rate is in the government, and it's just awful to live there. And then on the other hand, I have a couple of friends who currently live in Nicaragua who share the same kind of information that you're sharing. They love it there. They think it's great. The healthcare is great. The way of life is great. I'm just curious, why do you think that is? Why do people have such wildly conflicting opinions about Nicaragua? And I'd just love to have your perspective on that. I appreciate everything you do. Thanks for all the information you share.
That's an awesome question and a hard one for sure, but I think we have some insight. I really appreciate video questions being sent in. I appreciate all the questions, all the comments that I get. People who go down in the comment just say hello or ask a question. But these video questions are so fantastic because they let me engage with you guys. It's just really interesting. Any information for any of you who would like to send in your own video question, right down there in the show notes. Feel free. We love it when we get these, so please do. All right, but getting right into this, the first thing I want to preface with is different people have different experiences. This will happen anywhere. And just as personal examples from my own life, I grew up in Western New York, which is a very safe, very pleasant, very nice part of the United States, unless you consider its weather, and then it's a train wreck. But other than that, it's a beautiful area with vineyards and lakes and rolling hills and really good agriculture, and people are generally incredibly well educated and polite and friendly. And it's just a really nice area. We really pride ourselves on our food as well. My experience growing up in the United States is quite different than the average person who grew up in the inner city in, say, St. Louis. If you were to compare our experiences in the same country, and we only ever lived in the place we grew up, and we share those experiences with an outsider, they would feel that the United States had very disparate experiences. And it does. That's legit. Being different people, we have only our own slice of life to really comment on. So that can lead to that. Also, if we look at the United States today, just as an example, if you are aligned with one side of the political spectrum, you may have a very depressing time right now in the United States and view it one particular way, and your feedback to someone asking about what it's like there could be incredibly negative. Maybe depressing, maybe anger, but something in a negative range of emotion. If you ask a person who's on the other side of that same spectrum, the opposite political piece, they may give a glowing review that everything is wonderful and going fantastic, and they're so happy with how things are today. So our built-in perspectives give us a different view of the same thing, and our experiences give us different views of the same thing. So it's important to understand that while we may be picking apart underlying causes for large trends as to why people may have different feedback on a country, it does not illegitimize the potential for there to be really honest reasons why someone may have an amazing or an awful experience within a country. And we're going to do our best to try to extrapolate where it is actual information about a country, where we can, and where it may be isolated circumstances that lead to those kinds of answers. There's no great single, this is what causes it, but I think there's I think there's a lot here that will make sense. So to get started, we need a certain framework, a context to understand where we're coming from. And it's really important to note that we're talking about people who are, speaking of Nicaragua, a very small, very poor country located very nearby to the United States, a very large, very rich, very militarized country. Nicaragua has essentially no external involvement militarily with the world. The United States has so much external military involvement that many countries know them only as an occupying force. Nicaragua being one of them. So we're talking about a true military interaction for much of their histories. The United States began militarily engaging with Nicaragua in the 1850s. So the history of Nicaragua as a state was only about 30 years old when the United States began to try to make it into a colony. That started a bit of an adversarial relationship. Nicaragua was always seen as a key resource in the region and a linchpin to stabilization or destabilization within Central America. So the United States and other powers have always seen Nicaragua as a very important point to control or influence because it's just in such a strategic position and has such great agricultural and natural resources within it. So that's been seen since hundreds of years ago. That just sets the stage. There was relatively minor U.S.-Nicaraguan interaction on the grand scheme of things during the later half of the 1800s of the 19th century. Coming into the 20th century, however, the involvement between the United States and Nicaragua really came to a fever pitch around 1909. Starting roughly in 1909 and continuing relatively continuous to 1979 with varying degrees of interaction and influence. There were moments where there were pauses in activity, but essentially continuously for 70 years. During this period, the bulk of the 20th century, the United States began the military occupation and the placement of a dictator that was very cruel and not elected by the people by the United States began. And so this was a full, during most of this period, military occupation that put a cruel dictator and his legacies onto what essentially was a throne in Nicaragua. He moved up through the military ranks and overthrew any semblance of elected governments. There was not even a pretense of there being any kind of democracy or freedom or sovereign state in Nicaragua during this era. And this lasted until 1979. This completely colors the Nicaraguan story. Up until 1909, we can argue that the story between Nicaragua and the United States was one of one major conflict that went on for a very short period of time, but it is worth noting that Nicaragua, during that time in the 1850s, became the key battleground for all of Central America with the United States. Costa Rica, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, they all came here, and this is where they made their stand against colonization by the United States, who at the time felt that the entire region needed to become part of the United States. Mexico as well was generally considered simply to be a long-term play that they would eventually incorporate them. So all of the states in this region, all of the sovereign states in Central America and nearby, were really up against a major foe with lots of resources, but not what they have today. Looking towards manifest destiny, believing that everything that they could reasonably reach was theirs to take, and the idea that sovereignty like we have it today, where the people get to rule themselves, was absolutely the antithesis of the American thought process. Americans completely believed in power by domination and no free will of the citizenry. Now, that is mostly still the case, but has changed, and the thought processes around that are quite different today, but through much of this story, this is how it was playing out. And so you have to look at this perspective and understand this context to really know what it's like to be a Nicaraguan and to understand Nicaragua as a country. Because if you simply look at it from a very simplistic textbook perspective, it looks like Nicaragua had a non-free situation up until 1821, a colony of Spain, a member of the Mexican portion of the new Spanish Empire. And then for a couple of years, in 1821 and following, it went through the normal little hiccups and struggles as it looked to free itself from Spain and then from Mexico and then from Guatemala over a very rapid set of time and very minor military conflicts during that period, and quickly establishing itself as a sovereign country. Then coming to the modern era and saying this is a country that is easily a little over 200 years old. They should behave like a country that has been in place for 200 years. That is completely misleading. They were only free for about 30 years before they were colonized by the US. Then they had a period of about 60 years where they were independent again. This is their largest period ever in their history, was in the late 1800s, where they were able to function as a fully sovereign country. And then a period even longer than that where they were militarily dominated by the United States, with a very, very vicious dictator ruling over them. The people were essentially living in a giant concentration camp. This was a truly terrible period in their history. In 1979, finally, the people of Nicaragua were able to kick out the American dictator and start to take control of the country for themselves. The 1979 revolution brought Nicaragua into its own moment of sovereignty. This is an important time period because we can, in some ways, begin to calculate the history of modern Nicaragua, the state that governs itself, from this time. And we can compare it much to other places that establish a new country where one was currently or previously colonized, the United States being a perfect example. In 1776, the United States declared its independence from England, but it still had a bit of fighting to do for a number of years, and then a number of years before it was able to establish a modern form of government like it has today. From 1776, it took 13 more years, until 1789, when they finally put George Washington in as president, and our modern institutions and political documents, such as the Constitution, started to be used. So there's a 13-year period, and it makes a lot of sense when you think about a country that is throwing off the shackles of colonization, getting away from all the institutions that used to be there, and taking time to settle down, let the dust settle, and looking at what do we want to do to define ourselves as a country, how are we going to do that, and who is going to do that. That takes time, especially in the pre-internet era where people couldn't just jump on a computer and collaborate really rapidly. Not that that would make it fast, but it would help. But if we go back to there, the United States took 13 years, and then it took a long time before things like additional parties began to be involved, and the political system started to congeal into what we know today. And obviously, the United States is still fighting about this today, as all countries do. Nothing ever is permanently set in stone. But it gives us kind of a understanding from our own perspective, if you're coming from the United States, how this process might play out. Similarly, here in Nicaragua in 1979, there was a short period of peace as the dictator's forces fled, as the American forces that backed them pulled out, and Nicaragua was pretty much in a position of being able to oversee itself briefly. By 1980, just a year later, the Iran-Contra War began, and the United States was back at trying to reconquer Nicaragua. They gave them just a tiny bit of breathing, which was more of a chance for the Americans to lick their wounds and to try to come up with a way to cover up the battle that had gone on, right? We're not going to get into a bunch of that history, but in 1979, one of the reasons that the United States pulled out when it did is because the American people had never supported the war in Nicaragua, and it had to have been kept secret. The United States government was only able to wage the war in Nicaragua and do what it did because the American people were mostly unaware of it. There was some knowledge of involvement in a general sense, but the idea that things like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of everything, life, did not exist in Nicaragua under an authoritarian U.S. thumb was something that the Americans were told was not the case, that the maintaining of dictators and such was something the United States wouldn't do. In 1979, when the assassination by U.S.-backed forces of U.S. journalists on the main highway, which is now the Pan American, near the airport in Managua, was put onto ABC News live so that Americans could see exactly what was happening, and there was no way to deny it, the American public shut down the war in Nicaragua practically overnight, catching then President Carter with his pants down and leaving a permanent black mark on his record. Pun not intended. So there's a brief pause there while the United States regrouped and figured out how they could continue to wage a war in Nicaragua that the American people did not support. They did this by way of the Iran-Contra affair, where they used foreign money and the CIA to shuffle money around. A lot of people grew up in the 1980s like me, and the Iran-Contra affair was a normal part of everyday news. We were constantly being faced with the knowledge that the U.S. was operating illegal wars against the will of the people and doing so through highly criminal means, both criminal in the United States and on the world stage. From a Nicaraguan perspective, however, it is as simple as the United States had occupied the country for 70 continuous years. There was about 1 year of pause, and then it became a fight between the sovereign state of Nicaragua, which was brand new, and the United States and its backed military units in Nicaragua. This went on until 1990, so another 10 years. So those formative years where Nicaragua was a brand new country, didn't have its feet under it, was an active war, and there was no peace. There was no chance for a real free election process to really get underway because people were under the threat of military occupation all through that time. People were worried about maintaining sovereignty, not having smooth running government institutions. There's just no way that you can form functional, healthy government systems while you are fighting an active war on your own territory. It just is impossible. And just like the United States took time before they got to the 1789 Constitution and George Washington as president, they were during much of that time previous to it, actively fighting wars to simply maintain their sovereignty, and went right back to them by 1812 when England reasserted its belief that it had colonial power over the United States. It lost, but England thought up until then that the colony had not been lost and it was just a pause in the fighting. So this recurred here in Nicaragua with the United States being the colonizer rather than England, and Nicaragua being the place being colonized rather than the United States. But history does repeat itself. So until 1990, you're looking at a war zone of Nicaragua, but at least they were fighting to maintain their sovereignty rather than having to fight to achieve their sovereignty. So it was a different animal, but similar at the same time. In 1990, following a period of 80 years of nearly continuous conflict, a United States-backed and heavily financed political party was able to win the elections and take control of the government for the following 16 years. There are a lot of questions as to whether or not that was legitimate, but there's questions about every election that is legitimate, so we're not going to question them here. But there is essentially no side that completely accepts all of the different elections. Going into the 1990 elections, ABC's polls suggested a landslide of popular opinion in one direction away from American overall influence, and yet the American-backed candidate won, which is possible. We have seen this in other elections. Polls are far from accurate, but at the time, polls were far more accurate than they are today, and this was a surprising turnaround. But for whatever reason that it happened, American-backed but not American fully controlled in parties became the rulers of the country for 16 years until 2006. During this time, famously, much of the country's efforts and forward motion, what little bit they were able to do during the 1980s, was torn down. And what a lot of people notice today is this is the period where they went through and ripped out the rail infrastructure of the country to cripple the economy and ensure that it would be more difficult for Nicaragua to rebuild. They actively had their own government sabotaging the economy of the country, something that even after all this time has not fully recovered, even marginally, right? So far from where we were all that time ago. So during that time, yes, it was a sovereign country. Yes, they were operating on their own. Yes, in theory, there were functional elections, but that was very theoretical. There's always going to be questions about how accurate it was. And then in 2006, due to very obvious destruction of the company, collapse of the economy, terrible results in the ecology, much of which had also happened in the previous 1909 to 1979. The popular opinion swung so far back towards Nicaragua's own non-U.S. influenced government that it became a much more stable country at that time. That is, very importantly, 19 years ago. Right, so to put some important landmarks as to the timeline of Nicaragua, we are looking at a country that has only been sovereign for 46 years and has only had a non-foreign influenced government and or active war on its own territory for 19 years. So basically everything that you see in Nicaragua, any good or bad, is the reflection of only the last 19 years. Prior to that, you're not looking at the country as it is known today. And while that is the country of Nicaragua, and it's important to consider it, it's important to have this context that what a view of different time periods would come from. And an important thing about this, I first lived here in 2015. The country that I came to in 2015, while low cost and safe, was a dramatically different country than the one that I live in now. And I have been here for a number of years. It just took about 5 years from 2015 to around 2019, 2020, and visiting, well, really 2019 when I visited then. So just 4 years. Coming back to Nicaragua, it was a totally different place. When I was first here, the power was unreliable. The internet was slow and terrible. Coming back in 2019, all of that was different. Nothing was perfect, but the internet was generally fast. Not the fastest, but pretty good. And the power was quite excellent. By the time I was here full time and never leaving again in 2021, the internet was absolutely fantastic and a world showcase of how a low-income country can create and sustain important infrastructure for education across every level of society. The hospitals have went to a completely different level. The revitalization of roads and parks was visible everywhere. Safety was excellent. The power was a little bit improved. It took another year or so before it became the really good power infrastructure that we have today, but mostly that was because of massive municipal construction projects that required cutting into the grid and some things that were outside of Nicaragua's control. So just in that 4 to 6 year period from when I first lived here to when I permanently lived here, we saw a completely new country, and that was all within that 19 years. So all of the existing institutions, all of the tuning of the Constitution, all of the way that things function, these are all very recent things in Nicaragua. And so if you look at it from an American context, for example, 2006 in Nicaragua represents 1789 in the United States, that moment of complete sovereignty and stability, at which point we can start the clock ticking on now. We're a free country that is able to start making its own decisions and figure out who it wants to be and how they want to be that person that as a country can be. So that time frame is really important. So let's actually now dig into some of the things that you're seeing from people. So when you're talking to people who are now here in Nicaragua, you pretty much get a universal story of things are very cost effective, things are very safe, the country is beautiful, you have all these personal freedoms, it is a wonderful place, there's very little to complain about, and the things that we do complain about are things that are actively difficult and being worked on, such as now they're able to focus, right? We understand they've only been a sovereign country under their own control for 19 years. They're now, in the last year or so, really widely getting to things like litter control programs. There's starting to be an increasing amount of look at trying to deal with wild animals and healthcare of animals. Working towards new infrastructure projects, not just fixing what was there or shoring up old resources, but starting to create new ones and possibly looking at things that haven't been there in the past. The things are really changing. We're getting to a point where that stuff makes sense. So if you have people who live here today, almost always you're going to get glowing reports from the country. And if you've been here 10 years ago, when I first lived here, it would also be a glowing report, but not as good as the one today. Things are moving in a positive direction at an unbelievable pace. The fact that it is truly visibly improving day to day and at a really good pace are amazing things about Nicaragua. So basically, anyone that you're talking to today from Nicaragua is going to give you a pretty good report. You still have people with varying degrees of personal experience. So we have that person who we did a number of videos on and are still doing them on the trapped wife saga, right? He has some perspectives, very isolated, very anecdotal, and very filtered through someone that says, well, he came here and things were expensive and things, but even there, if you probe into the negative, and sometimes you have to probe into positive as well, but you probe into some of that negative and it becomes, well, I didn't have that expense. Someone told me they had that expense. Well, okay, we can't really count that in most cases. Or I found it really difficult to run a business here. Well, that is true. It is difficult to run a business, but you can't really take someone's business failing or success as a good guide to a country, that is. Because, for example, I've had businesses fail in the United States and businesses succeed in the United States. If you ask me at the moment, or if I had stopped being in business when my business failed, my report would be the United States is hard and business is difficult and you shouldn't do it, you should just give up. And if you reported or asked me at the time that my business was being successful, I'd be like, oh yes, no, business is a wonderful thing. The United States is a great place to have business. Your personal success heavily colors your view of the country unless you're really able to step back and look at other people and look at the big scope of things. If you're using your own experience as the basis, for your guide to how good things are. Some things are better than others for that still being meaningful, but for the most part, it's meaningless. Any given person is going to have a good or bad experience in life, and without the context of more people and a broader scope and visiting other places, they tend to attribute that partially or wholly to the place that they were living. So if someone comes down and just does something stupid, ends up in an accident, hurts themselves, has to go to the hospital, doesn't do the things they're supposed to do, doesn't have a great experience, they may attribute that to, coming to whatever place I was in that happened being negative. And if you go someplace and everything just goes right, even if you screw everything up, you may be like, wow, this place is fantastic, nothing can go wrong. Neither are really accurate. It just means that that is the experience you had. One of the reasons that living here and putting in an effort to talk about these things is so valuable is that you talk to lots and lots of both locals and expats and evaluate their situations. So when an expat says, oh, this wonderful thing happened, you could be like, okay, yes, but winning the lottery is not meaningful. We have to rule that out. It's an outlier. It's not part of the Nicaraguan experience. And when someone says, oh, well, I don't like it here, and you say, why don't you like it here? And you say, because there's this great thing somewhere else. And you say, oh, have you been to that place and witnessed that thing? No, but someone told me it's better somewhere else, so I perceive this as negative. Those are important probes. Okay, you're stating that this is negative is a relative compared to a mythical place that doesn't exist. That's not a good comparison. It's kind of like saying, Earth is bad because heaven is great. Did you go to heaven to evaluate it? No, I was told it was great, so I'm guessing that this is bad. That's potentially true, but you're doing that based on a made-up relative. You're guessing what good is like, and you're setting that bar, rather than saying, okay, if I actually go to another place, right? If you're a Nicaraguan, have you actually gone to another country and tried to live the life that you're doing here, do similar things, trying to work, trying to go to school, how is it over time? Then you can start making comparisons. And still, it's just your anecdotal experience. But in so many cases, from every direction, right? We hear constantly complaints about Nicaragua from Americans who aren't even sure where Nicaragua is on a map and know nothing about it. And we see this constantly, right? As someone who has a channel, I get so many comments. You guys don't see them because we delete obvious fake comments. But people come in all the time and make really profound, direct, this thing is true. And they say it to me. And I know it's not true. I live here. I can look out the window. They'll say things like, there's no electric there. There's no internet there. There's military on the street. And you're like, I'm here on the internet. I can take on my live stream, walk out to the street and show you that there's no one on the street, right? And this is a constant thing that someone tells us, someone who's clearly never been here, has no idea what this place looks like, what the day-to-day is like, and they'll make these statements claiming things to be true at people who know better. And so either they're just bots, which is totally likely, or they're not even bothering to watch the show, or they do and they can't realize that what they're seeing is actually Nicaragua. Look at the show. If you knew Nicaragua, you'd be like, I know where that is, or I know about where that is. That clearly looks like Nicaragua in most cases. But if you are completely unfamiliar with Nicaragua and you watch the show, you may think that I'm somewhere else because you don't know what it looks like, so you have no basis of comparison, and you can make these claims. So we get these claims from many Americans on a constant, daily basis, claiming things about Nicaragua based on completely made up details. But we also get the same thing from Nicaraguans. They are constantly pointing to a United States that they've never seen, or other places, but it's very often the United States. And this mostly comes from some combination of the U.S. news being the thing that dominates the market here, and Hollywood. There are so many American TV shows and Hollywood movies that are the basis of media and entertainment in this region. People watch that, and they watch, Home Alone. It's a Christmas movie. They watch it here too. And you look at Home Alone, and it's just some Yahoo parents with a bunch of kids, and look at the mansion that they live in, and look at the cars that they drive, and the vacations that they can take, and the things that they can do. And of course they know that Kevin and his antics are fictional. But they don't understand that the size of the house, the level of affluence, the not needing to work 6 days a week, the being able to be home at night with your family, the never having to talk about work, the not being so stressed, the only having one income instead of two people having to pay for the house. And they don't talk about being leveraged to the hilt in debt, the things that would naturally have under normal circumstances. They don't see those things, or they don't understand that those things are fiction as well. And they say, I want a house like that. and he has no job, and she doesn't have to work at all. He just has some throwaway job, and they have all these kids. How could anyone have this much money? No one does. Americans don't live like that. Right? And very, very rarely. But they imagine that that is what normal life is like because that's what's portrayed on TV. If you watch Nicaraguan TV, which is very rare, you watch Mexican TV, Colombian TV, they portray quite often very poor barrio life as part of telenovelas. That's a very normal thing. And sure, they also then mix in some rich people. They show some hacienda somewhere, some beautiful ranch or whatever. But people understand these are the rich people that are far off, and this is the barrio life. But when you're watching a lot of American media, there isn't that poor, everyday, real life in America. No place like I grew up is ever shown. No place like my friends who lived in poor houses in small villages. No one who lives in the inner city. Those things are never shown. Or when they are, they show something like Full House or Family Matters. Okay, I'm dating myself. These are shows from the 80s. But they both show inner city housing that should have been very cramped, very difficult to raise any number of people, but when they go inside the houses, they're huge. They have many rooms that make no sense. They're 10 times the width of the lot that they're sitting on, instead of being in a near war zone part of the city. So everything's, flowers outside and neighbors stopping by, and they make it look like the inner city works out like the most wonderful of safe suburbs, which is, of course, not the case. Hollywood magic. We understand that because we have the context of knowing what we're looking at, which things are fanciful. Of course, we all wish we lived in that world. As Americans, we do too, right? But it is a fantasy world. So Nicaraguans who've not been to the United States often have these glowing things to say about it and have this opinion of it that is based on completely fictitious things. But like anything like that, the drive to want to believe that such a place exists and that it's accessible to you, it can be overwhelming. And so a lot of Nicaraguans and people from other parts of the world see this fictitious view of the United States and want to get there. They want to find it for themselves. And because it's a dream, because it's an emotional attachment, they won't listen to when people say, that's not what it's really like. You're not going to get a visa to get in there. 2, you're not going to get the kind of jobs that those people have. 3, you're never going to get those houses. Real Americans can't do that, right? Rich millionaires Americans can't do those things. People who have generational wealth, they can't do those things, right? The safety that they're showing, that doesn't exist. Not that it's so bad, but it's not good like this, right? Your kids playing in the driveway in the middle of the inner city, that's not real. Right? And so all these things, they just don't believe it for kind of obvious reasons. And likewise, Americans don't want to believe that other places are really nice. America drives home a vision of this is as good as it gets. You don't ever even want to evaluate other places because it's just a waste of time. It's going to be awful. You'll be so sorry you left the United States. And many people on both sides fall for this. The grass is greener in the U.S. because the U.S. controls the media, whether intentionally or just naturally, doesn't matter. It provides the view of America to the world, and it's hard for anyone, including Americans, to see past it, even when we know it's a fiction. So that gives you some context for the people who've never evaluated multiple places. Then the question becomes, why do you get such different reviews of people when you're asking them who've been to both places? So again, people have individual personal experiences, and we don't want to minimize that in any way. But if you are, and this was mentioned in the question, talking to people who left Nicaragua 20 plus years ago, you are not talking, and even if it was slightly less, you're talking about people who at best left at the early formation of the current Nicaraguan government as it is known today, the non-U.S. Influenced country. But if they're truly at 20 plus years in the United States, that means if they came for the 16 years before that, between 20 and 36 years, they left a Nicaragua that was ruled by an American semi-puppet government and was definitely very set on dismantling and ensuring a bad future for Nicaraguans. So while growing up during that period did not generally involve being strong fear of being tortured or anything, it does have a very negative time period, and I believe that the crime rates were moderately high. Nothing like you would really worry about, nothing like we see in other countries in the region, but much higher than Nicaragua has now. Nicaragua has been on a downward trend for violent crime for quite some time, and now it's come to a really good place, but it did come from higher, but it wasn't bad. It was, a lot of the surrounding countries are truly bad, so people often picture it. And it's worth noting, again, if you talk to Nicaraguans who live in Nicaragua, they say, oh yeah, no, we have a lot of crime, it's dangerous. But if you probe them as to what dangerous means, they're talking about having things stolen or pickpocketed. They're not talking about being killed or maimed in most cases. Their perspective as to what danger is skewed, and that's far more informative than their opinions on things being dangerous. Basically, all people in the world feel that where they are is dangerous. But what matters is, what do they feel the risk is? In America, we generally feel that our fear is, well, my neighbor might shoot me because they don't like the beer I'm drinking that day, or a car might run me off the road, or I might be arbitrarily detained. I might be exported even though I'm a citizen, right, which is pretty unlikely, but those are the kinds of fears that people actually have. In Nicaragua, the fears are, well, I may have someone, pressure me to give them a few dollars for food, or someone might steal something from my hand. These are the much more likely fears, and that gives you an idea of how safe a country is. Like when I used to live in Romania, they would say, don't go to the other countries. You have to lock your car doors there, and you can't keep your valuables in your car within sight. People might even, jimmy the locks on the car. In Romania, they didn't feel that was a reasonable fear. But if you go just a little bit farther to neighboring countries, suddenly you have, someone might actually, take out a weapon or smash your windows to get to things, not just try to pick the lock, right? You have varying degrees of danger in these cases. So it's a very important thing to not just take face value, because people generally don't have the perspective to understand what they're seeing in one country versus another. They hear things like, oh, it's dangerous. They go, well, we hear that it's better than here, so I'm going to adjust and figure out how what I'm seeing here can be defined as danger. But when you probe those things, generally you get better information. It's much like Amazon reviews. If you go onto Amazon and look at the reviews, and I know because I have a book on Amazon, and my first review was a review of something else. When you read the review, none of it had to do with my book. It was just a review of random things. They were angry about something, and they'd accidentally ended up on the page for my book, and they wrote there. So if you look at, I had a 1-star review from a person who had never read my book. They didn't even receive it, apparently. Or order it or something. I don't even know if they were related. I don't know what they did, but it wasn't read my book, and they had not one word about my book to say. So the review is clearly meaningless, but you can't get rid of it. Amazon doesn't let you do that. So you're just stuck. So you hope that other people will provide real reviews, and enough of them will eventually make the bad one go away. But it's a difficult process when you don't probe. And coming from companies that try to collect cheap and easy data rather than probing to get quality data, I'm quite aware that I've seen this done with HR departments, where people lost their jobs over completely fake data because the HR department didn't want to admit they didn't know how to do their jobs, and so just used whatever data was cheap and easy. Same thing happens here. If you're not careful, you just ask people what they think. They'll give you an opinion on a country real quick and easy. And really, that opinion, if you don't probe it, might as well be thrown away. And the same thing goes for me. I'm giving you a positive opinion of my experience in Nicaragua, but you should probe me as well. Well, what does that mean? What kind of good experiences have you had? Have you had negative experience? What is your experience coming from somewhere else? Why do you feel it's good? Actually understand why we're saying these things. And I feel that because of the show, I'm articulating this on a fairly regular basis, and that makes it easier for me because I understand the context that I need to provide. But for most people, they are not even thinking about the fact that they may be looking at a skewed context. They're imagining one of the components and then filling in the gaps from the other. Whereas I grew up in the United States and lived in many different parts of the country. I worked all over the world and have a lot of comparatives, and I talk to lots of different people, so I have the input from other people as well. That's a much more difficult process, but very meaningful. So if you're talking to people who left Nicaragua between 20 and 36 years ago, you would totally expect that their reviews of Nicaragua would be quite a bit more negative. If I was here during that time period, mine would be relatively negative as well, because those same things that made their lives not that great would also make mine not that great. This makes sense, right? There was obviously a period where it wasn't that great. If you're talking to people that were here between 36 and 46 years ago and left during that period, they will be giving you a context of the Nicaragua that I left was a war zone, because it was literally a war zone. Right? It's not like one, it was one. So we totally expect people to say it was dangerous back then. It was not very free. Even though it was sovereign, it didn't have the power to control its own everything, right? Very, very limited. And so anyone coming from that period would have a very different opinion. Now, anyone coming from before 46 years ago, from 1979 and before, they would be, especially in the later years, also in a war zone, but one where they were not sovereign, and reporting about a brutal occupation and dictatorship. Of course, anyone coming from that era, we expect to have terrible reviews of Nicaragua. So it's important to understand just the time frame alone, that when you ask us, you ask people who live in Nicaragua, you ask people who are visiting Nicaragua, you ask people who are talking to you about coming, and you're getting real-time, real-world reviews, you tend to get glowing reviews, because for the last 19 years, things were at least moving in a good direction, even if at the beginning they were still pretty rough. But quite some time ago, quite a bit more than 10 years ago, I think the first that we looked at Nicaragua from afar was about 14 years ago. And at that time, it was already you really need to check out Nicaragua, because everything you feel about it is wrong. It is a different place than you imagine. And we saw some pictures of it and we looked into it. We're like, wow, that's really interesting. It took us a few years. And then we came for the first time and lived here briefly. And we were completely blown away by the trajectory of the country, the quality of everything, the food, the weather was hot, that's true, but just everything was moving in a good direction and was in a good enough place that we didn't have complaints about the place that things were, the power, the roads, the internet. Those things were all good enough. They're fantastic now for the most part, but back then they were good enough. So by 2015, we felt really confident in Nicaragua having already gotten to a good place. So pretty much anyone for the last 10 years that you talk to should be reporting, by and large, a pretty good experience in Nicaragua. It's been safe all that time. For example, even when they've had events that people point to as being dangerous, when you look at them statistically, it still falls into a pretty safe country, even in its worst weeks, which is amazing. As bad as Nicaragua ever got, it only ever approached the danger of parts of the U.S., it never got to be a really dangerous area. Scary, that is different than dangerous, right? There may be a lot of people who had concern. We talk to expats all the time. Wow, it was scary? Oh, it was so scary. Okay, were you ever in danger? We think so. Was there a statistic to back that up? No. That doesn't mean that they weren't. Doesn't mean that it wasn't scary. And it doesn't mean that they didn't stay safe by taking drastic measures. That's all completely plausible. But very limited in time, and statistically, it does not show up as a dangerous period. More dangerous than other periods, but not a dangerous period. Very important to keep actual numbers in mind, because that helps establish when you're collecting these anecdotes. When you're talking to people in big numbers, and you're talking to your friends that are in the United States, and they say, well, I was there 20 years ago, and it's a dangerous place. Well, look at the statistics and say, is that borne up by reliable statistics that make sense in other places? And when you do that, what you see, we don't know about 20 years ago. I assume that they're correct, right? They're just giving a out of time report, and you should never listen to what a place was like 20 years ago. 20 years ago, Ukraine was not a war zone. 20 years ago, Syria was not a war zone. 20 years ago, the United States was a completely different country. 20 years is enough for everything to change. So we can't really usefully use things from 20 years ago. Even Europe, very different 20 years ago. I first spent a lot of time in Europe in 2012. That was the year that I put a huge amount of time in Europe. And that Europe of 2012, by the time I was putting in another large block of time in basically the same places in 2019, I lived in Europe basically in between, but I had a very specific large block of time in 2012 that was kind of mirrored in 2019. And the continent had changed climactically during that time and gone from one of the most amazing experiences, and I wanted to live there so much, to the people didn't change, the food didn't change, the politics didn't change, but the weather changed so much that it no longer held the same unbelievable perfection of place to live in the way that it had just 7 years prior. So that's really important. Things shift, and you have to use current data, and this is good advice for anyone, about where you want to live in the world. Always have some amount of flexibility, because everything changes over time, including the weather. So that's important. So when you're talking to people who are here currently, they're generally reporting that it is currently safe. And if you check that against things like Numero and world statistics and look at the crime rates, you'll see that what we report matches what they show there, which is that it is very safe, but clearly not zero crime. And then when someone tells you, well, I heard about this crime, you say, yes, and we hear about crimes in the United States every day. That doesn't mean that there's a lot of crimes. It just means that there's stories that are in the news and they're interesting, so people read them, so they get reported on. But that statistic that says there's X amount of violent crime, and Nicaragua and the United States are roughly similar, with Nicaragua being just slightly safer, there has to be some amount of violent crime, right? One of the tricks that people try to play is by saying, someplace that is relatively safe must have no crime. And that is not at all how it works. No place has no crime, right? But for places that are normal, there's a normal amount of crime. So you will always hear about a murder, a theft, a robbery, a car accident, a carjacking, right? It doesn't matter where you are. You could be in rural England. It happens every so often. And when it does, it hits the news and everyone talks about it. And it only takes one vehicle in a huge area doing something, or one person doing some crime. Every person in that area gets that newspaper, gets that news report. Right, so you could have a village of 100 people, and someone murders someone, and you get the news, and it's like, whoa, someone murdered someone. Or you live in a country like Nicaragua, and there's 7 million people. One person gets murdered. We get the same news. Someone was murdered, right? Emotionally, we have a very hard time telling whether it's 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 7 million. One is very dangerous to be in that statistically, right? And the other is very not dangerous, and yet we emotionally see them as nearly identical. So time alone will give you completely different results. So realistically, anyone who's been gone for, say, more than 15 years, anything that they're giving you may be completely true and honest, and they may be giving it to you with good intent. But if they're saying that Nicaragua is dangerous and that they've been out of it for 20 years, either they're completely ignoring everything that should be really obvious about Nicaragua, that would take some effort to truly ignore that much, or they are just blowing smoke and they are intentionally telling you something that they should know isn't applicable. You can't you can't say it's dangerous now based on something from 20 years ago. Even if nothing changed in Nicaragua, that would still be, well, it wasn't back then, I don't know now, right? That has to be the way that it's stated. So those reports must be fake. They should know not to say those things because it's just slandering the country for no particular reason. Now, it is also worth noting, when you have migrations of people, and this is always the case, 2 factors happen. 1, when you move to a new country voluntarily, you are emotionally tied to that new country. You will generally report the new place that you've moved to as being better than the one you moved from. This is part of the emotional and positive life of expats. As an expat, and I have a video called The Power of Expats, we talk about how just the act of being able to choose your own country and having the freedom to move to it makes you more powerful and your life better. You have more business opportunities, you have more job opportunities, you have more flexibility, you have more knowledge, more experience. You are in a better position in general. There's always exceptions. So in doing so, if you have people who move from Nicaragua to the United States and people who move from the United States to Nicaragua, like me, both parties will likely report an improvement in their lives simply because they became expats. But if you were to move from a third-party country, say Italians are moving to either the United States or to Nicaragua, they're going to have that positive became an expat in both cases. But they could make a more comparative of it's not the becoming an expat that makes one good or the other not. Both are equally expat locations for them. Then they can compare the actual countries one to another. I naturally like Nicaragua in some ways more than the United States because it's not my home country. That just gives it advantages. It's very similar to the vacation advantage, right? You're going to like places where you take a vacation more than places where you work. Why? Because you do fun things in one place and not fun things in another. That's pretty clear that fun things make things happier, and being in a new country with new adventures where you're unique generally is fun and advantageous, so we expect that. Second thing, when you're moving like this, there are people who live in Nicaraguans, who simply gravitate to the American adventure more than they do to the Nicaraguan one. They feel that the politics better represent them. They feel that the culture, the food, the music, the job opportunities, or whatever fits them better. That makes sense. Not everyone is completely culturally aligned with the place that they were born. And as a great example, I am not really greatly culturally aligned with the United States. I'm not particularly fond of most of the food, although I do love pizza and subs. And the music, yeah, it's not bad. The general going out culture, it's not me. There's so many things that just don't quite fit my lifestyle, and I found places like Spain and Italy to be better fits, and in the long run, Nicaragua to be an even better fit than those. So for me, coming to Nicaragua, I naturally gravitated to a place where I'm really happy with the way that things are run. I'm really happy with the things that they provide, and the way that like going out for a beer and hanging out with friends generally happens, right? All this wonderful, happy stuff for me. That doesn't mean that one is better than the other. It is simply that when given the freedom to move, when you have the power to move, you're already in that expat potential category. That means you're already in a little bit better spot. You've become an expat. That gives you an advantage by just having that freedom. And then moving to the place where you believe you're going to fit, one, you feel more empowered because you chose it. And you chose it presumably based on a belief that it is a better fit for you, which it probably is. That would be a weird thing to get wrong. It may not be the best fit for you, but better than where you came from is very likely. And so in doing this, we kind of naturally separate that the people Nicaraguans who would prefer to be in the United States are there, and Americans who would prefer to be in Nicaragua are here, and both parties will report that the other place is better, but they're giving you a personal opinion. It fits their lifestyle better. So we have to expect that in general. So almost all the expats, regardless of which direction they went, are probably happier. They wouldn't have gone if they weren't going to be. However, it is worth noting the things I said about the media information. It is really uncommon to have Americans who move to Nicaragua and truly are unhappy. Some decide it's not the right place for them, but rarely does someone move under duress, under a real feeling of failure. It's like, well, I want to move on and try a different place. But Nicaraguans who move to the United States have a very high failure rate where people are desperate to get back home and often end up trapped because of the economic situation. They may not be able to get back home and then feel very negative about it. So that's another factor. Now, a really important factor that we need to address as well, and this is something that we know happens. Moving south to Nicaragua is generally a completely free and open process. Nicaragua essentially begs people to please come and experience the country, experience the history and the culture, and witness what Nicaragua is truly like, because it is extremely difficult to come to Nicaragua and not fall in love with the country and have an appreciation for its culture and history and what has happened to it over time. Once you see it firsthand, many of the things that are said about it can't be believed. They are simply implausible. And so they really want people to witness it, both for Nicaragua's own sake. It helps protect them against negative feelings being created by people who've never been here and are trying to discredit the country. But it also provides an important framework for the world. It is a perfect example for Americans to come to and find out what the world can really be like. It is one of the most acute places that you hear so many stories about, and when you get here, it is so easy and quick to demonstrably prove to yourself that the majority of what you have learned or been told is clearly fake, and fake to a point where no one even put in an effort to try to come up with plausible, meaningful lies. They just made up stuff and hoped you would never look any further, and 99% of people never do, so it's generally an effective tactic. On the other hand, of Nicaraguans who go to the United States, they are often going in blind and have very little path back. The United States holds most people at bay and cherry picks the people that they want to allow in. So they generally look for people who are likely to be favorable to Americans' government, not Americans, but the government's views of how they want people to think and behave. And they're very, very picky about this. The average Nicaraguan will never be given an opportunity even to vacation in the U.S., let alone to live there. And they have to do this because if every Nicaraguan went to the United States, visited for a little while and came back, the majority of the people who do move to the United States wouldn't, and the U.S. is generally very dependent on low-cost labor from this region. They don't want too many people to have first-hand knowledge. They want to make sure it is people that are either becoming trapped or people that are going to still feel that they should be there and so forth. So, of people who move to the United States, especially from Nicaragua, this is important to understand. Many move believing that they're moving to a paradise, that all they have to do is play by the rules, and they're going to be given free money and great health care and mansions and all these things. They truly believe this in many cases. They think it is the land of milk and honey. And when they get there, they are put into programs where they are at risk. It is very difficult for them to return home, and they are then moved generally into a required asylum process. And this is very, very, very important to understand. When you're in forced asylum, what they do is they put you into a position. Right now it's under the parole program, but there's other programs. And part of that program is that they have to declare asylum at some point during the parole. And if they don't, then they get deported. So the threat of deportation, which could be financially crippling, many people go with no financial means of returning. They have nothing to come back to. I've spoken personally to people who owned businesses, sold their cars, their family business, mortgaged everything that they had, took loans out from family members, pushed everything to the limit in the hopes of getting to the United States without having ever seen it before, just trusting that it will be a financial windfall that allow them to fix all of these financial problems that they created back home. Being deported back with no money whatsoever, because that's generally the case of what happens during a deportation, or extremely little money, after not having been in the United States long enough to establish a career and to send money back, generally means coming back to abject poverty that is far worse than anything that they experienced prior to having gone to the United States, and coming back having failed at moving to the United States. There's just this accumulation of problems, and some people are leaving because maybe they have a record that they want to have expunged, or hope that it doesn't follow them. So that's not too common, but those are risks, right? People going into these programs are rarely people who are succeeding really well or in a really good position. That would discourage them from going. So they're in this position where they feel trapped, and often are forced to declare asylum. That means that they are making a public statement denouncing their former country. This is taking a stand to burn your bridges and request, normally based on Fed information, asylum in the United States. So the U.S. government tells people they must say this. So this is not people saying it voluntarily per se. And so once they do this, they do not have the freedom to simply say, "Oh, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean to make these false accusations. I didn't mean to commit a crime in my home country," right? Because claiming asylum for something that isn't true is a crime, as you would expect. You generally don't get to go anywhere in the world and declare asylum unless there's like an act of war or famine. Those are reasonable things, humanitarian asylum. But if you're claiming asylum just because you want a job or you just want to try a new country, you are generally burning all of your bridges with your former country. And most countries would consider that criminal activity. So this is important to understand that they are burning their cultural bridges in many cases to do this, and are now trapped in a system where the United States can deport them at any time that they want, and can tell them that they need to say and present whatever image that they need to. And even if the United States doesn't go to individuals and make them do this, the threat, the knowledge that the United States has absolutely no obligation to keep them. They can deport them at any time for any reason. And that if they don't show up as saying the right things, as doing the right things, that increases their chances of deportation. They have to make themselves look good, or they're in not just an inconvenient situation of having to return to their former country that's not where they necessarily wanted to be, but in a position where they could be deported to a third-party country. They might be simply put in prison. They could be deported directly to a prison in a third-party country. They could have everything that they have lost, and there's a whole bunch of risks that they imagine that may not be true, but they don't know whether or not they're true, and they don't have access, in most cases, to lawyers and good counsel and in deep information and historic information, and not having passports, right? They are absolutely trapped. If they have done something, either before they left or after they've gotten to the United States, that is a crime or could be construed as one, then they are in a very scary position. That deportation is so much more than an inconvenience. It could be a life-destroying event. And so the fear that drives people to say whatever they feel the United States government wants them to say is undeniable. It is such an unbelievable driving factor. And that doesn't mean that everyone does it. It doesn't mean that it's orchestrated. It doesn't mean there's a conspiracy. And it doesn't mean that the United States is putting these words into anyone's mouth. Although we have seen an unbelievable amount of copy-paste patterns on doing this. So there's no doubt whatsoever. It is absolutely known that somewhere there is a training camp that is teaching people and telling them what to say and how to say it to get very specific messages across. Now, who exactly is doing that and who is having them say that, we don't know 100% for sure. You can never track all these people down. But that it is happening is undeniable. So this is the likely place where it is happening, because this is a free labor pool who can be easily monitored and has a natural threat that they have no way to get out from under. So no money has to change hands, and you don't have to have a really, really clear instruction. You can just hand out the information as needed. Boy, these are the things the United States would love to have you say, or this is the impression that other people have of your home country. You should consider warning others, right, that this is what it's like. And so you anybody who is an expat living in the United States from a country that they could be deported to, where they're in any way seeking the ability to stay. Right? If they're temporarily visiting and you know they're just heading off on vacation or they're moving on to the next place and they're totally free and easy to do so, you can roughly trust their opinion, at least as far as that goes. But anyone who is seeking long-term stay in the United States, you simply cannot trust what they're saying because, one, the United States has no obligation to tell you about its propaganda. That's a law from under Obama, that is one, I use it all the time. It is an incredibly important part of American culture that cannot be overstated how much that means the government has no obligation to be honest with you. So the information that they are pushing out, they're making people say, there's no reason to think that it's honest. Two, because even if there's absolutely no pressure and no one mentions it, it's super obvious to pretty much anyone who's going through a process of trying to become a permanent person in a country that they're going to want to say whatever it feels like wants to be said. So there's going to be an incentive, even if it's just in their own minds, to say, well, I know that this is what the government wants me to say. They may not tell me that. They may not even pressure me. But I want to look good. I want to show up on the radar as someone who's going out of their way to do the things that they want long-term in the United States, and to give them some reliability that they're going to go throughout life in the United States and mislead Americans in the way that the government wants them misled. A lot of people will jump on and say, well, of course, we don't want anyone coming to America who's not a true patriot. But that is absolutely what you don't want if you're the government. A true patriot would always tell Americans the truth and let them make their own decisions, letting Americans be informed so that Americans could have freedom of speech, freedom of the election, right? You don't have a democracy when you don't have information. You simply don't. Democracies depend, to be a democracy, on an informed public. If you hide the reality from the public, that's the same as rigging an election. It's 100% fake election because what they're voting for isn't the thing that they're told they're voting for. Right? So this is key. So by encouraging people and pressuring them or giving them a sense of need to present a certain false image of the outside world, it is a way of rigging elections in the United States. And so that is something that people feel they need to do, and you can't trust that information from someone who is very likely under a stress or duress scenario, even if it's only in their own minds. They simply believe that they have to do these things. They have to present this kind of information because what is the alternative? What could happen to them if something went wrong? Whereas most of the expats that we know here in Nicaragua, yes, you could easily make an argument. Well, we want to impress, the country too. We want people to, want us to stay. Well, that's a reasonable argument. Of course, anytime you have someone who wants to be anywhere, that's a possibility. So that's an important context to always maintain. But unlike Nicaraguans who are moving to the United States and live under a constant threat of deportation and deportation after having claimed asylum, being in Nicaragua, we never have to claim asylum. That's not something that comes up. Nicaragua doesn't want us to do that, right? It is not offered on a plate to us. It's definitely not a rule that we have to. It's never even mentioned, right? The idea that we could claim asylum is like, what, we could? I suppose there's situations where we could, not under normal search, right? You have to have a reason for it, but you could come up with one, right? And if Nicaragua wanted to run propaganda schemes, they would want you to, right? They're like, well, let's run with this. We have Americans who are willing to say whatever we want, right? So they would encourage you to do that. But you're not getting those stories from Nicaragua. You're not getting anyone claiming asylum to be here. They don't have to claim asylum to be here. That alone tells you so much more than anything that any person can tell you, right? All those people, or nearly all of them, who are telling you that Nicaragua is dangerous or you shouldn't go there, I bet you'll find from your description that either they are originally from here and are always, because there's no such thing as security in the United States, they will always be under the threat of deportation. They can always just claim that their paperwork was wrong. They can always just say, we don't care about your paperwork, right? There's so much flexibility to deport or detain regardless of the status of the paperwork. But anyone who's attempting to stay has so much incentive. They have to say exactly what they think people want to hear. That is the nature of being in that part of the process, because their only alternative is being deported back to the place that they just spent so much money and time and effort to leave. But for those of us who are here in Nicaragua as expats from North America, With the rarest exception, I'm not sure I could point to a single person that I've ever met or heard of, we have the flexibility, if Nicaragua was for some reason to decide they wanted to deport us, which could happen, right? En masse, very unlikely. Individuals, of course, it happens. You screw up, you don't do your paperwork, you break the law somewhere, you could get deported. Always a risk on the individual level. But we rarely look at being deported back to the United States, or even if we are, it's a temporary thing. We would be deported back to the United States, simply get on the next flight and move on to whatever country we want to go to next. If we want to move to Mexico or Panama or Thailand or the DRC, wherever we decide we want to go, generally we're able to. We don't have limits on our passports in most cases. We don't have limits on our transit visas. We're able to fly nearly anywhere in the world. Most Americans have at least enough savings or income to be able to afford migrating back to the U.S. temporarily, getting on another plane and going on to the next place they want to live. And expats especially typically have more financial power than non-expats, so it's even more likely that we'd be able to do so, and we have the knowledge to do so. So the ability of a country like Nicaragua to actually put realistic pressure on expats in their country to say things that are not true, to, you have to say negative things about America, you have to say good things about us, or what, right? Yeah, you can deport us, but it's not going to do much, right? We'll just move on to another place. It's not a real threat. So unlike the average Nicaraguan who's living in the United States, who fears being in a financial position of being sent back and doesn't have very many options, typically, the average expat in Nicaragua has absolutely all the options in the world. No one is trapped. No one feels that they can't go anywhere. And you can prove it by watching any expat that you know. Chances are they're going to other countries on a regular basis. If they felt trapped, they would just not come back. They're coming back because they have 100% break by moving into another country, moving meaning crossing over for like a border run or visiting family for Christmas, and then going through all the effort of buying a ticket, bus or plane, and returning to Nicaragua to reestablish themselves. That's not something that Nicaraguans who are saying Nicaragua is scary and being in the U.S. do. They're not going back to Nicaragua, actually checking it out, and then making the decision to go back to the United States again. They're staying in the United States in most cases, and that really, really tells you a lot. There's going to be exceptions, for sure, but I bet the ones who are telling you things are in a position where if you probe just a little bit, you will find where they are reasonably scared of expressing their true opinions as to safety or efficacy or whatever for them. And then there's another group that we need to mention. Now, this doesn't fall into the category of the ones who were brought up in this video, but it is important for a lot of people who are watching this and say, okay, but I have people that are quite old and they tell me these terrible, terrible horror stories. They tell me all these things about land seizures and torture and all these things. You say, yes, okay, great. When? Are you talking about after 1979? Or before 1979, and it's always before 1979, right? Probe and figure out what's going on. They say, some terrible thing happened. Okay, by whom? And universally, when I talk to people who do this, it's always either terrible things happened by the U.S., right, by the U.S.-backed government, the U.S. puppet that was doing these things on the U.S.'s behalf. So the place that you should be upset with is the United States, or, and this comes up quite a bit, when in 1979 the country became sovereign, there were quite obviously a large percentage of the population, not meaning 50%, meaning like 5%, who were actively using the occupation and the dictator for their own gains. They were willing to sacrifice their fellow countrymen to take advantage of the situation and to actually curry favor with an occupying force. And this would be equivalent to, for example, in if we're not going to use World War II as an example because we don't want to invoke the group of people involved there, but let's say World War I, and if you have Germans occupying France in World War I, which was a much more amicable war than World War II, but imagine if you had some people in a French village who are, and I'm both German and French, so this is an example I'm allowed to use, the French go, you know what, this invading army, I think I can make some money, I can, turn in some, innocent French freedom fighters. I'm going to call in my countrymen. I'm going to, just do favors for the German army. And I think that's where my bread is buttered. And so I'm not going to do the right thing and stand up for my country. And I'm not going to do the scared thing and just hide and do nothing. But I'm actively going to try to profit off of the situation and take advantage of the people who are either scared or the people who are disadvantaged or the people who are fighting for the freedom of the country, fighting for their sovereignty. And so there was obviously a lot of people who did that, who became associated puppets of the United States, people who worked for the dictator, people who committed the murders, who committed torture, who did seize land, because up until 1979, the U.S. backed a lot of land seizures. That is a real thing. But watch for people who tell you, oh, no, land seizures is a thing. Probe them. One of two things is likely to be the case. Either they're complaining falsely, because they know, no one's not aware who says this, that it was the United States or the U.S.-backed government that was doing the seizures, not the Nicaraguan government since the last 46 years, since it was a sovereign country. Or they're pretending that there was they may have just made it up completely. Well, they can't point to the land. They can't come up with an actual example. I'd say 9 out of 10 times that's actually what's happening. But when you find someone who's like, no, there was actually a case, and you ask them, and you ask them and ask them until they have nothing else to say, eventually they normally end up with, well, actually it was seized prior to 1979, and it was returned to the actual owner. It was an undoing of a seizure. But if you're the one who had seized it, and then you had to give back stolen goods, you got caught red-handed, so to speak, you may be angry and bitter and portray that as a seizure. So when, in 1979, the country became sovereign, a very large number of people fled Nicaragua who had been profiteering and taking advantage and harming Nicaraguans, in some cases murdering Nicaraguans. And those people were liable for war crimes, for murder, for torture, for theft, all kinds of things. And instead of facing trial, logically, many of them fled to the country that they were working on behalf of. And of course, as we've seen many times, the United States generally welcomes with open arms those who worked as foreign agents for the United States abroad, as most countries do. That is generally expected to be the case of how things behave. Of course, right now, the United States is not taking Afghanis who did exactly that for the United States back. So it's not completely guaranteed that that would happen, but they did in the 1980s. So many moved to the United States, but they did so because they were aligned with this situation prior to 1979. In not in all cases, of course. Some people moved out of the country because there was this incredible economic collapse. The country was already in terrible economic shape in 1979. The damage done during the 20th century to Nicaragua was unspeakable. After 1979, with the U.S. continuing a war on the country, the changeover of the government causing massive economic upheaval, and the attempt to start to create education systems, get food supply going, to get women's rights on the books and things. There was so much upheaval and so much work to be done that time period during the 1980s, while politically pretty good, was economically still an absolute disaster, and there was no clear path forward. And it turned out that in 1990, the government came in and intentionally destroyed as much of the country as they reasonably could through governmental means for that 16 years. So when you take that, it really was a quarter of a century or slightly more, even after sovereignty was established, that if you saw the writing on the wall, it's just like, you know what, this is going to be rough for the next 26 years. I want to support my country, but I have to support my kids and family too. A lot of people made the judgment call to go to where was accessible at the time, which is often the United States, especially as there were so many people who had done work for the United States, had represented the United States' interest in Nicaragua. A lot of other people were able to flood out kind of in that as well and just be part of the big welcoming of Nicaraguans into the United States at the time. So you have a lot of people who left during that time, and then mostly they have kids today, and you're hearing stories of, well, things were tough, and they may have very innocent stories as to why they went back to why they went to the United States, because we've seen many of those coming back and being like, oh, we left because it was such hardship, and I got to grow up in a country where I was safe, and now Nicaragua's been safe and starting to be prosperous. We want to come back and help rebuild our country. We want to come back and be part of that story. And we see so many people all the time that are coming back, and Nicaragua welcomes them back with open arms, right? It is, yes, come back, bring in the diaspora, rebuild the country, take over the old family farms, start putting things back together, put families back together. That is happening. So we see a lot of that. But a lot of it is people going, is it okay now? Right? Because they grew up with these stories, and it's hard to get past those stories. Just like El Salvador is going through now. They've only had a couple years of safety. There's so many stories of how rough it was that it's hard for people to say, well, can I really come back? Is this going to last? Is that really? They don't really mean it's safe, right? It takes time because we've had, for me, my entire life, 45 years of El Salvador's crazy dangerous, and then just a few years of no, it's crazy safe. What? That takes a long time for your mind to switch, and it takes a long time after your mind switch to say, oh, I'm going to go back. Right? So this is a long process of making it so that Nicaraguans feel confident in returning to their home country. But we're seeing that of those who left for good reasons, or that in many cases, we're also seeing the children of people who may have sided with the dictator prior to 1979, and they felt they had to leave for the safety of their families, but their children had nothing to do with that, and they now long for their homeland or their culture, and they see it, are starting to see it as a safe place that they get to return to as well. And so there is, and even them, right? I've spoken to people who are like, my parents were really involved, very, very political prior to 1979, and not in a pro-Nicaragua way. And even they want to come back now. Even they see it's so safe, it's so good. The country that they had created was a mistake. And now there's this beautiful country that is sovereign, that they can come back and explore for themselves. And so that was a very long thing, but I think all of this is important to understand that there are these different segments of the population that are going to have reasons to tell you that Nicaragua is great and reasons to tell you that it's terrible. And some of them are just organic, and some of them are just being lazy, and some of them are just misinformed, because many people are just repeating, right? Because if you live in the United States, you will continue to be bombarded with false information about Nicaragua. And so if you have a foundation of things were bad at one point, and now you're getting these continuing reports that make it seem like nothing has changed, why would you believe something has changed? And why would you put in the effort to go check if you truly believe that's the case? So in some cases, that is also what's happening. But those people do bear a responsibility. They do need to come and check for themselves if they're going to continue to repeat that information. They need to actually show that they have a reason to be saying that, and not just because they think it's what they have to say living in America, which that strong artifact. And we see this in the comments that a lot of people, we never see this from the Nicaragua side, but we do see it from the American side quite often, that people will come on and post and threaten us for not lying about Nicaragua because the United States will get you, right? And I'm not saying that it's Americans saying that, and I'm not saying that it's real, and I'm not saying it's the government in any way. I'm saying that it is enough of a fear in the United States that people can feel confident that a tactic to shut down the conversation is to threaten Americans that we will be caught for exercising our freedom of speech, that our rights as Americans are somehow anti-patriotic, which is the weirdest thing ever, right? People who hate the Constitution, people who hate freedom of speech, people who hate all of Americans' foundation are like, you better do things that are completely un-American or America's gonna be mad. And you're like, I don't think you know what a patriot is. And I don't think you know what America is. And I don't think threatening an American for things in America is the way to go. It's a weird tactic for sure, but it's effective clearly for a number of people, where they wouldn't be encouraging people to do it. But those of us who know better, right? Even now, America does protect American citizens pretty well, and we do have certain rights, and exercising those rights is part of being a good American. It is your obligation as an American to exercise those rights. If you believe that Americans should not exercise the rights that they fought for, you're basically saying they should still be England, because they should answer to the king and not have the freedoms that are the foundation of why America exists, right? That's a weird place to be. So it's amazing how often the people who are claiming to fight so much for America are the people fighting hardest against it. It's America that they dislike, and they're trying to make it someplace different because they don't like the place that they have for whatever reason. But with all of this, hopefully this gives a framework for understanding one, how to probe and that you need to probe and understand why someone is trying to say a place is dangerous or expensive or whatever. Just like we did with the trapped wife discussions. How could you come up with these conclusions? Why didn't you talk to us and have us show you that when you said, I have to have two large, expensive $70,000 trucks? Why do you feel that way? Right? Did you talk to someone? Did we dig into it to figure out why you had that impression? You feel that the rent has to be this really high rent. Why? When those of us living here can happily live I have a beautiful apartment, $180. Not this place, this is my house, but I have an apartment, $180 a month. Is it fancy? No. But is it comfortable and nice? Yes. Is it way better than a lot of people live in the United States? Yes. $180. Not furnished or anything, but so if you feel you have to spend $10,000 a month or some crazy number on rent, come and talk to those of us who live here. We can show you. Maybe you can't get 180, maybe it'll be 250. But those prices exist, and you can go live in those places. If you 2 bedrooms, it's not huge. But right, if people aren't coming and you probe them, you're like, okay, how did you determine this to be true? Well, I didn't ask anybody. Okay, did you check this firsthand? No, well, it wasn't me, right? That probing information really fast. So probe the people that are giving you what you feel is misinformation, and probe people that you think are giving you correct information. Don't let your own biases make you ignore testing the waters with one group that tells you what you want to hear or you think you should be hearing, and only probe those that you think are telling you what you don't want to hear. It goes in both ways. Emotionally, we're very bad at decision making as humans, so it's important to have a consistent process and really be like, why was it so good, right? And that will help, and understand that over time and from different places, like the experience that people have will be dramatically different. But the only things that should matter is only experiences that come from more or less, and this is true everywhere in the world, nothing to do with Nicaragua. All the experiences should be a combination of what's happening right now and in the last, say, 10 years at most. Anything more than 10 years is essentially meaningless in the grand scheme of things. There's just too much that has changed. And the world is changing very much. And anything that happened pre-COVID, anything that happened before all the shakeups in the markets today, those things don't really matter. So even if you're talking to someone who has experience within the last 10 years, make sure that you're understanding what their experience is and question, and do you feel that experience would be true still today? I understand that you may not have a really good context for understanding, is this still true today? But that's a part of this show, is we're showing a lot of Nicaragua on an ongoing basis. So there can be things that were just a few years ago. For example, someone might say there was tons of potholes in the main highway. It's just terrible. I don't want to drive anywhere. You can watch my show and say that may have been true just before Scott's show. Maybe it was true a long time ago. Maybe it wasn't. But right now, we now know it's not true. Potholes are relatively rare. So by looking at the videos of the highways, which we drive all over the country, and they're just like you can see hundreds of miles of roads at any given moment, you can say, okay, whatever it was in the past, that may help us establish a trend, but what matters is it good now? Roads are good now. Is internet fast today? It doesn't matter if it was fast 6 months ago. It's fast now. Right, and that's another one, a great example, because we just had this conversation in the WhatsApp Expat group this morning. Someone who's been here said, oh, the internet in Nicaragua is so slow, it's some of the worst. And a bunch of us are like, we have really fast internet. So that's demonstrably false, because it only takes one person getting fast internet to prove that fast internet is available. But you can have unlimited number of people who don't have good internet that think it's bad. And let me give a better example. You can say Walmart is really far away. It's hard to get to. And someone who lives there can pull out, go a block, and pull right into the Walmart and say, I was here, it took me 2 minutes, no traffic, easy as can be, parked, and I'm in the Walmart. You could have 100 people who don't know where the Walmart is, who all drive in the wrong direction, get lost and take hours and never find it, return to the house and report that no Walmart exists. No matter how many reports you get that Walmart doesn't exist, the one that proves that it does is the only one that matters. Now, if you had none, you would surmise, well, no one was able to find the Walmart, it probably doesn't exist. That'd be reasonable. But once you have proof that it's right there, all the ones that suggest that something else is true are known to be meaningless. They're not just bad information. They're utterly worthless because something was wrong. Same thing with the fast internet. We can prove that the internet is very, very fast and reliable. But we can also prove that if you incorrectly hook it up or purchase from a slow service or, use bad equipment, that will make things slow. And often people then test, so we'll look at the speed I get. You say, okay, but that's the speed of the plan you paid for, most likely, has nothing to do with the speed of anything that you tested. You're only testing what you paid for. Did I get what I paid for? Yeah, it showed that you got what you paid for. So you're not testing the speed. Of course it goes faster than what you paid for. You can always get more. You're claiming that the entire country is slow based on the speed of your connection. And the example I used in that case is if you were measuring the amount of water going in over Niagara Falls and you say, I heard that Niagara Falls has a lot of water, but you took a gallon jug and filled it and then looked at how much you were able to measure and say, I only measured 1 gallon. Niagara Falls is tiny. It's the smallest waterfall in the world. People would think you were crazy because clearly you're not measuring what the falls can do. You're just measuring how much water fits in the 1 gallon jug that you brought. And that's how people tend to measure their internet. They measure from their house, often over Wi-Fi. They're measuring their Wi-Fi equipment before it even hits the internet. And in many cases, that's their slowdown. Here in my house, many times I'm doing so many things on the internet or on my network that the bottleneck is inside the house. I don't have enough wireless to get full speed out to the internet. So if I test anything, I'm not testing the internet at all. Once I get to the internet, I need to test locally to connections in the country, but most people test internationally. And they say, well, the speed is good, but it's not as much as I would hope. You say, well, but you just tested internationally and said, it's only this fast all the way to, let's say, Denver. But if I lived in Denver and said, okay, I'm going to test the internet, and then tested the speed of getting a single connection all the way to Nicaragua or, Panama, people would be like, you're crazy, test to somewhere else in Denver. Anything beyond that, you're testing the length of cables, you're testing multiple connections. You're not testing your connection. And that's really obvious in those cases. But the number of people who in Nicaragua test in this really weird way gives complete misinformation. But those of us who actually test locally can show you time and time again that the speeds are amazing and far above average in the United States, which is not the best measurement, but it's really, really good here. It's a showcase in the world stage of how internet can be done in a low-income country. It's really impressive, but we have to be careful. We have to probe and see if people are actually measuring something meaningful or just reporting on misinformation, just like the Walmart run or the gallon jug at Niagara Falls. So with all of that, hopefully you have the tools to determine whether Nicaraguan information that you're getting not is whether or not it's true, normally it is, but is it meaningful? Does it apply to Nicaragua, or is it stories of another Nicaragua from another time, just like King Arthur's England may have been a real place, probably not, but if it was, no matter how much you read it, no matter how much you study it, no matter how many people read that book, it has nothing to do with the England of today, which speaks a different language, has a different culture, has a different government, and so forth. There's no connection between the two other than more or less living in kind of the same land, sort of, even that. Not that close. Thanks for joining me. Like and subscribe. If you'd like to help support this channel, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Scott Allen Miller. If you want to help support Marcela in her fight with stage 4 Hodgkin's lymphoma, all the information is down in the show notes. There's a GoFundMe link. We really appreciate everyone who's helping to make her cancer treatments and recovery and process possible. We're trying to raise, we've already raised $1,000 before we started the GoFundMe, $4,000 additional to help with 2 years of all of her expenses with having to have people to take care of her, transportation, watch her kids, cook for her, clean her house. It's a lot of things she's not able to do. Her health care is completely covered here by Nicaragua, but there's a lot of ancillary costs that come along with that. We want to make sure that she has the comfort to be able to not stress about being able to take care of her children during this time as she has to travel between cities, put them in a different school, and so forth. If you don't know the story of that, go check our video from a few days ago that goes into great detail. It came out on February 4th, which is World Cancer Awareness Day. But the outpouring of support about her needs has been fantastic. Thank you so much to everyone. At the time I'm recording this, we're at a total of $1,500 raised, so we still have $3,500 left to go, but we have a lot of time to do that. This is to care for her for 2 years. So if we can raise that over that time, she's going to be in very good shape, we hope. And as always, write in with your questions. Get down there in the comments and say hello. If nothing else, leave your comments. And as always, I'll see all of you tomorrow.